about it. I'm Sylvia Henderson, your host, and I invite you to tune in, take what you see and hear, and, well, think about it. So today, we are going to be talking about working from home, but this is a topic that precedes and supersedes the whole COVID-19 experience. It's probably made it more real for more people, but I've wanted to talk about this for a while. So my guest is Tammy Bjelland, and her company is Workplaceless. And so Tammy, welcome to Think About It.
Thanks so much for having me here, Sylvia. I'm happy to be here.
So my first question always to guests is what brought you to doing this for your business and making it your business? I'll tell you the reason why I wanted to interview you is that I've been fortunate enough to experience working from home, or at least working remotely, for a long time. Long before it was even my own business, I worked for a major company, kind of the Google of its day, 35, 40 years ago. And we had flex time. So there were times when I was able to work from home to get a task done. Now, obviously, 40 years later, technology has enabled a whole lot more than way back then, but I was interested in how working from home has evolved, even long before half the world was working from home. So that was why I wanted to have this interview with you. So pass it to you. How did this come to be your thing?
Yeah, so similar to you, I had my own personal professional experience working remotely, and that was what drove my passion for remote work. I was living in Spain, and I decided to move back to the States, and I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted to live, but I knew I wanted to move back to somewhere in Virginia, and I ended up in Winchester, Virginia, but there weren't a lot of jobs in the field that I was looking at. So I decided to search for remote roles, and I landed a really fantastic role at an ed tech company that was based in Utah and Vermont. And then some of the team was remote, and I ended up loving that position. I loved remote work. I decided that I was not going to work in an office if I could help it. And in 2012, I started my own business and got into more instructional design, corporate training, and identified some real gaps in what was available for professional development for remote workers. And one of those things is, well, there's a couple main gaps, but on one side, you have people who are just not necessarily prepared for working on a remote team. So they don't have previous remote work experience. And then there's also a gap in leadership and management skills when you're not physically around your teammates or your direct report that you're managing. So those were the two primary gaps that I saw, and decided to launch Workplaceless in 2017 to fill those professional development gaps. And fast forward to 2020, and now the whole world is working remotely and realizing what those gaps are. So it's been a very interesting time.
So I would have pre-COVID asked you how accepting has it been in the corporate world and the government world, which has been less accepting even, of the remote working. I know things were starting to evolve with the Starbucks, working in, or the co-working spaces becoming popular. Now I would imagine more organizations are more open to it. But what are some of those challenges that may still be there today in terms of accepting the work from home or the remote work? Because I guess it's not always home.
Right. Yeah, we present there are three factors that are needed to make remote work successful. One is mindset. So everybody at the organization needs to have the mindset that is supportive of remote work. That understands that remote work is possible, as well as a viable model for working. Then you need infrastructure. So you need a remote work policy, you need other policies that support remote work, and then of course you need the tool stack you need the technology that can support remote work. And finally, you need education. So you need to be able to train and upskill those individuals that are working, that are leading, and also that are driving the mission and the vision of the organization. So even up to the executive level, there needs to be educational support for understanding how remote work works best. And the primary issue, and you alluded to it a little bit, is mindset. So when we talk with organizations about the possibility of extending a remote work policy, the biggest barrier that individuals cite is mindset. So leaders feel unprepared or uncomfortable managing team members that they don't see. Team members are worried about, the result of that kind of worry, which is micromanagement or distrust. So there's that mindset is a huge hurdle. And I don't see that going away, especially because the situation that we're all in now, which is a lot of organizations have realized that remote work is possible for their knowledge workers. It isn't the ideal situation. And so when you have a current crisis like we're experiencing right now, you have people working in suboptimal conditions. So before the interview started, we were talking about, just trying to find a location in your home that's free of clutter, that is, not populated by your other family members, right? That's a very different situation than what we typically see in remote work. And so the concern that we have and that other remote work experts have is that there might be a backlash against remote work and productivity when we can go back to normal, because we have been working under less than ideal conditions. And so this isn't remote work. This is working during a pandemic. Right. So the mindset is definitely going to continue to be a huge hurdle, and especially in industries that were typically resistant even before this whole experience.
So what I detect from what you said is working from home or remote work in the normal situation, to be effective, needs to be a planned strategy in an organization. Whereas obviously in a couple of months, we've been just thrust into, oh crap, we got to do something away, so we weren't prepared. But so let's talk a little bit more about the strategy that that I'm sure your business is in the business of helping an organization. I would think with that strategy, the mindset opens up a little bit more, and we'll talk about tools in a little bit, because actually this interview is a slight example of bandwidth, and how some of what we do is kind of doing like that, but we're getting used to that for the home bandwidth. But let's talk first of all about the strategic setup of a work from home or remote work strategy.
Yeah, so with a strategic approach to remote work, you really first consider the purpose of going remote. Are you why are you doing it? Right now, we have a very clear reason why everyone's doing it, but that doesn't mean that everybody's on board with that, or that is tied to the company's mission or culture. And so having a strategic approach to remote work means going through a process of developing a remote work policy, piloting that remote work policy, iterating it, and seeing where there are gaps and where there are issues, and then addressing those gaps in a targeted way. So we have a course called Go Placeless, and this leads change managers through the process of creating a remote work policy. And we start with culture. And we do so in our leadership course as well, because if a remote work policy and how you roll out remote work is not aligned with that company culture, there's going to be huge issues. So we start with culture. We lead change managers through creating a culture canvas and aligning the online culture, the virtual culture, with the culture that is manifested in an office environment. Then we go through the subsequent considerations that you have to take into account when you are creating a remote work policy. So how are you going to measure productivity? How are you going to, what resources and requirements do you have? Like, are there compliance considerations that you need to be thinking about when it comes to different laws or regulations that apply to your industry? What resources will you make available to your team members so that they know that they have support? So there's a whole set of steps to go through and questions to ask. And we worked with change management consultants who specialized in taking really large organizations remote to develop this process of, you address your culture, then you talk about productivity, and then you talk about requirements and resources. So it's a very, it's a methodical process, and it really opens up a management team's eyes when it comes to all of the potential parts of a remote work policy.
Okay, wow. And I would, is it, well, obviously top down is where it needs to start. And that's the executive office, that's HR, that's all of those factors in an organization together to create this. Does anything ever come bottom up in terms of creating that workplace policy or that culture? And the reason I ask, I'm thinking things are so unprofessional or kind of real personal right now. Like we can be in office, in business meetings, and the dog walks up and and stays on camera, or the kid walks by, and we're getting used to that. Do you think some of the policy or some of the culture actually will change bottom up as professionalism changes because of remote working?
I think that potentially it could, and actually I think that's a pretty big concern for people who are in HR, for instance. They might be concerned about, when we do go back to normal, are those standards going to adjust? And I think that really just depends on your company culture, and it also depends on your industry too, because in some industries, like in the tech industry, you can be a little bit more informal depending on the context, whereas you're in government contracting, less wiggle room in terms of professionalism, right? So I think it just, so much of it depends on the context, but I do think that change can happen bottom up. I think it's much, much harder. And some of the tools that can help somebody that wants to extend a remote work policy beyond the end of COVID, they would be in a really good position if they could gather some of the data from their experience, if they have numbers that can prove that they are equally productive, et cetera, to make a business case for going remote. And so if you're concerned that your organization might completely backtrack and require everyone in the office forever and ever, now's the time to be compiling some of the information that you would need to make a really convincing business case to either let you stay remote or your team, or at least provide that option. Because that's really, I think, what people are worried about, is not being able to choose what is best for them, what is best for the organization.
Okay. So that was a lot, but it's kind of focusing still on, in my mind, on mindset, getting leadership, getting management ready to deal with that, with remote workers, or I'm going to say hybrid work environment, because I believe the real reality will be some in a space consolidated, some working remotely, more maybe working remotely. We got about a couple minutes before a break. I want to move to the second item you talked about, infrastructure, and we'll just start now, and then after the break, continue. Infrastructure, maybe one thing. So, well, you talked about policies. I'm thinking tech, and not to get deep into tech, but maybe something about, the workplace, the workspace, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about infrastructure. What about the workspace should be considered for professionalism?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, the standards are in flux, right? So what we're suggesting to folks now is that they make the very best of the situation that they have, leverage some of the tools that offer some ways to sort of, hide your background if you are in a cramped space, or if you don't have that opportunity or the space to, completely separate yourself from your family. Zoom has backgrounds that you can add. And so that leverage those tools, and make people aware too of what kind of situation you're in, because I think right now we're really experiencing a wonderful opportunity to learn about each other personally, and also demonstrate and build our empathy muscle. And I think that the workspace specifically is a really good opportunity to or context to provide that, but creating as much of a separate environment as you possibly can does wonders for not just the professional aspect, but also in separating your work activities from your personal activities, which can help with burnout.
So let's continue the idea, some of that infrastructure conversation when we come back. We need to take a quick break. And with that, we'll be right back. Well, hello and welcome back to Think About It. I'm still Sylvia Henderson, your host, and we are still talking about working remotely. And my guest is still Tammy Bjelland from Workplaceless. And we'll tell you how to reach her towards the end of the show. And you are experiencing the excitement of this whole remote working, because now my phone is ringing and I can't mute because I'm interviewing you. So let's just keep on going.
Let's just keep on going. I think that you can tell everyone that you planned it. You planned the phone ringing. All of this was planned to really demonstrate some of the challenges that come with remote work, which is, we don't have total control over our environment. We don't have total control over technology. And when people are distributed, everybody has different limitations, different considerations for that technology. And when it all converges and you want to get something done in real time, it seems like almost in any situation, there's going to be some sort of complication with someone, right? And the more people you add in, the more possibility for complication. And that is one of the most frustrating parts of remote work, because it is impossible to control all of those elements. And so before the break, we were talking about infrastructure, and part of that is the technology. So the tool stack, as well as the access, and how you enable access. And one of those things is internet connection. And so we have no control over bandwidth sometimes, so we can upgrade as much as possible in our given area, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is still the bandwidth that's needed to do a lot of the activities that are required, or access some of these tools that perhaps require bigger bandwidth than other tools. And so that is a really big challenge. And I don't necessarily think that anybody has figured everything out yet, especially for people who are in communities or areas that don't have many options for internet access. So one of the really amazing benefits of remote work is that you're able to expand your talent pool and also offer opportunities to people who have been excluded from the digital economy. So people who are in rural communities who don't have access to transportation. But one of the really significant challenges about that is, the access to internet. And we're seeing that now, in such huge numbers, people who are struggling to access and have the access that they need to just do their jobs. And then for students as well, a lot of students don't have internet access at home, and so they're not able to access online learning, which is what most schools are doing now.
I think there's a good news, bad news with this experience so far. And for me, the good news is that there's more acceptance of, I'll say, imperfection. So people are getting used to the buffering issue. They're getting used to sometimes the background not being most ideal. They're getting used to some things that previous to March 2020 might not have been so accepting. So, so a little bit about boundaries, because that strikes me as part of adjusting to the remote work issue experience also. So providing, what are some of the boundaries that need to be thought through in terms of, should the company provide the internet connection? And if so, should the company provide the computer or the phone so that somebody can be a remote worker? And if they do, then the company expects, no game playing on the company computer, and that kind of stuff. There's boundaries that get imposed on, I think, or crossed. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's where that remote work policy really comes into play, right? And so for organizations that do need to have control over that, there are some serious compliance issues that come with accessing data. And so for organizations that really need to maintain control over that, they will issue company issued computers, and they will restrict what you can access and the tools you can access. I mean, even Zoom, for instance, has been having, a heyday, but also there's been a lot of backlash because of some of the security concerns. And so in some organizations, you can't even access Zoom at all. And organizations, they've been making those choices for a long time. And it really comes down to how much of a risk you want to put your employees at, your company assets, your, customer data, all of that. It's really a matter of risk. And so when it comes to boundaries, if you are using your personal computer for work, that's where things get a little bit murky. And that's where, you really need to have a remote work policy in place. And, I'm not a legal expert at all. So I'm just going to put that disclaimer out there that you need to work with your organization's internal resources and seek external resources that know about those policies and what you can require and what you can't require. But certainly there are security concerns with accessing data outside of an office that has a secure network and secured equipment as well. So it's definitely a huge issue. There's also, right now, another industry or another tool that's seeing a huge rise in use is like productivity monitoring. So like video monitoring of like your activity. And I have some feelings about that. That's where, the boundaries get pretty tricky, right? And it just feels icky, right? The constant monitoring. And earlier in the interview, we were talking about culture, company culture. And one of the things that is so important in remote work to make it work, to make that mindset appropriate for remote work, is trust. You need to be able to trust that people are doing their job and they're doing their best, especially right now in a really tough situation where everyone's just trying to do what we can. And so that kind of monitoring, to me, if it's not done with the right intentions, or if it's not executed in a way that is aligned with your company mission, you really run into a problem or a possibility of a severe trust issue. And I've definitely heard stories of tools like that being implemented, and there being a huge backlash, because it really, if you don't do it right, it really does indicate that you are not trusted, right? Or you're not trusting of your employees. And that is a bigger concern than just making sure that somebody is at their computer when they say they are.
Yeah, and I'm reading more and more, especially in places like the Wall Street Journal and all about, there are tools that are being implemented now in the name of health and safety, but how many employers are going to be willing to backtrack and get rid of those tools, after the world has returned to a new, a new world in a year or so. So anyhow, I want to touch on your third point before, because time flies fast quickly, on education, which I think probably solves or can help many of the other two topics in terms of, so what kinds of education, it's a big question, and probably a big answer, what kinds of education is needed um, in order to have an effective remote work policy or remote work experience. Just the presentation part, I'm thinking, and we were talking before the interview about presentation skills for those who are running virtual meetings and how to present, and what part of you is in the picture and all of that. That's just one kind of training. What other kinds of training do you do for remote work?
Yeah, so we have several programs to upskill workers and managers in how to work effectively remotely. So we have a program that trains on the basic remote skills. And so that's like, just getting your work done at home, setting boundaries, how to measure your productivity, how to collaborate with teammates when they're not right next to you, how to make sure that you are being compliant with rules and regulations, and then also how to be self-motivated and get work done on your own and figure things out when you don't have an IT department like right down the hall to help you troubleshoot your internet connection or how to use Zoom or whatever. So that's our flagship program, is a remote work certification program. And then we have a leadership program, which is really in need right now, because if you can train leaders and managers in how to effectively manage remote team members, that those skills trickle down to your teams. And so that program, we talk about culture first. So again, it's really important for us when we talk with leaders and organizations to really think about culture and how that plays out in a remote environment. So culture, communication, how do you manage communication? And specifically within that module, we talk about asynchronous communication. I think right now, one of the biggest issues that we are seeing is that people are just trying to recreate the office environment via Zoom or via video conference, and people are experiencing Zoom fatigue. It's a term now, but being on video conference calls all day long is not an effective use of time. It is draining in a way that in-person meetings are not. And so remote teams really need to completely rethink how they communicate and how they collaborate with one another, and then how they measure the output or the outcomes of those collaborations. And we really focus on that in our leadership program. So communication, managing performance, managing conflict, managing so vision and goal setting. So how to set a future plan for your team, and then how do you actually carry that out? So change management is a big issue right now. And then finally, how do you train and support and develop your team members with learning and development? So that's our leadership program. And then other really hot topics right now for us are setting boundaries in order to prevent isolation and burnout, and as well as leading productive meetings. So we mentioned earlier about focusing on asynchronous communication. That doesn't mean that we get rid of every single meeting, but I do think that for remote to really work well, people need to be very strategic about how they're using people's time. And that means asking the same questions every single time when you schedule a meeting. What's the actual outcome? What do you want to accomplish here? And if it's just sharing information, then that should not be a meeting. That should be a completely different avenue for sharing information. And then if you do have other purposes, like if you want to come to a decision, if you have to discuss something or share ideas, if you have to actually collaborate and create something as a result of that meeting, then that needs to be really clearly stated, and you need to design a meeting so that you can actually achieve that outcome. And I think too many people just schedule something on a calendar and 6 people show up and there's an agenda, right? But it's just a list of things to update people on, as opposed to an actual outcome and then strategic activities to lead to that outcome.
So how do you, as we're coming to a close, unfortunately, there's lots more questions to ask, but coming to a close, how do people reach you and work with you, most importantly?
Sure. They can find out more information at our website, workplaceless.com. So workplaceless.com. And if you want to reach out to me individually, you can do that at Tammy@workplaceless.com.
Great. And in the final, like 30 seconds or so before the end, what's in the new hybrid work environment that I believe the future holds, like one quick point you want people to leave the program with?
One quick point that I want people to leave the program with is that remote work is possible, and it can bring many, many benefits to your organization and to you personally, but it takes work and it takes a specific skill set to make it work. Luckily, there are tools and people that can help you be a remote work champion.
Tammy, thank you. And you are that person with the tools. So thanks for being my guest today. And I invite everyone, as usual, to tune in and take what you see and hear and, well, think about it. And it's up to you to make a great day.